Welcome to Different Parks and Recreation at Home. My name is Stephen Gary with Different Parks and Recreation Social Enrichment. Today we're going to be doing a little bit about embryology, exploring parts of an egg. So for this activity, you'll need a napkin, of course, for cleanup, an egg or two, maybe three if you're doing it with a family, a plate, pencil, maybe toothpick, and an egg parts sheet diagram. Or if you don't want to print one out or don't have a printer, you can simply draw one yourself. Just draw kind of a oval type shape and draw the parts of the egg that you see. Okay? Before we dive too much into this little video here, what are we going to be going over? I mentioned the parts of the egg. Also going to be learning about the life cycle of a chicken, or I guess how we get these egg products from a chicken. Okay, you may be thinking, oh, it comes first, chicken or the egg. A little bit of both. You need the chicken, of course, to come from the egg. And so, how does that happen? So in this video, we're going to explain about that. So we're going to jump into that. And so, we have, of course, our eggs that you buy from the store. Or, of course, the eggs from a farm. Now, these are just two store-bought eggs. But eggs from a farm and eggs from a store, they're really hard to tell the difference. Eggs from a farm may be a little dirtier, maybe brown, maybe blue, maybe polka dotted. They can vary depending on the breed of the chicken. Now the big difference can be in the taste, because your farm eggs, those chickens may be free range, out and about eating bugs or grubs or whatever they think they can find, whereas your store-bought eggs are typically they're mass produced, so they're not fed your wild range, your bugs and things like that. Therefore, they're fed a feed, sometimes medicated, but it's a whole different thing. But the main thing is when you are trying to, say, hatch a chicken, is a fertilized egg versus a non-fertilized egg. Okay, that's the big kicker. And the big thing is the fertilization. So what is fertilization? It means that the egg has been fertilized, that there will be life growing inside the egg if all of the conditions are met. And just like when we're growing, we need certain things to survive and thrive and to grow. Now, a fertilized egg, we're going to pretend this is our egg, our fertilized egg from our farm, needs certain things from its mother, its hen. Or if we're the ones doing the hatching, then the incubator. It's a machine, don't have one today, but it's a machine you would put your eggs in that will act as your mother hen, so to speak. And this machine would provide all the essentials to create life. Now, you'll be thinking, what are those essentials? But think to yourself, what are some things that you need now or when you were growing up? You need warmth, water, oxygen, and some protection. And so you're wondering, how is the egg going to get all those things if it's inside? It's this embryo is developing. How's it going to get water? How's it going to get oxygen? How's it going to get warmth? And so the hen would use the bottom of her butt, all the fluffy feathers there. She would sit on it and pretend this is our nest. She would sit on them, on the clutch of the clutch of eggs, and kind of roost there and keep them warm. Now, how warm does it need to be? About 99.5 degrees. So think of your nice hot summer day. That's about how warm it would need to be. It would need to maintain that temperature for 21 days, so about 3 weeks. Now, it's a long time to keep those eggs that long. So, does the hen just sit on it that long? Yep, she sure does. She would sit on the eggs, maybe get up, walk around a little bit, but go right back to sitting on them to keep them warm. Now, if, say, our hen is just sitting, this is my nest, if our hen is just sitting on top of this egg here, okay, and her bottom just has the warmth on the top. Now, is the egg going to heat thoroughly? Not quite. You'll just have a half-heated egg if you just have the heat on one side. So what will happen is the hen, from time to time, she'll use her beak or her claws and kind of move the eggs around so they turn a little bit so that they heat evenly. And it's just how they have developed their instincts. They have learned to just turn these eggs naturally. Now in an incubator, they would have a turning function, of course. They have a belt and some dividers, and the belt would drag, it would hit the dividers and kind of roll the eggs a little bit. That way, they get heated all throughout. Now, another thing that I mentioned is that water, that moisture. You may be wondering, why does the egg need moisture? And that is because eggs are pretty solid. Okay, imagine if you are a tiny chick okay? And you have to break out of this shell after 21 days. If you dropped an egg or you rolled around an egg, they're pretty solid. They don't just shatter open if you drop them. And so that moisture helps soften up that shell. There are pores along the egg shell, and that moisture kind of gets into the pores and softens it up a little bit. If you didn't have that moisture, then the chicks would develop inside, but they wouldn't be able to get out. It'd be too strong and too hard. And so with a mother hen, that moisture would come from just what's in the air or her body. If you've maybe held hands for a long time, or you're moving and active, you start sweating, and that kind of gets a little bit of moisture going, and that moisture with the heat, you get humidity, okay? And so you would want about 65 to 75% humidity. So imagine kind of taking a hot shower and all that water vapor that's in the air, that's that humidity. And so if you had an incubator, you would just kind of set your little dial up to about 65, 75% humidity. If you have a higher humidity, it's okay, but it will be a later hatch, but that's okay. In nature, they can't control it to a T, so she'll just sit on it until the eggs hatch. Another thing that they'll need is protection, okay? Is on a farm, there may be predators, maybe foxes or other little critters, or even germs for that matter, and so the eggs need protection. And so you have, of course, the shell that protects the egg, but what about those things that you can't quite see? There may be germs outside, or even maybe germs if you're doing it in a classroom or at home. There is a protective layer around the egg that keeps it safe, keeps all that bacteria and stuff from getting into the pores, called the cuticle. And so that will kind of cover and seal up the pores so that if there's some germs or something hazardous to the egg, keeps it safe. Because you don't want things to be passed on from the hen or outside to that developing chick, okay? Now, so we've talked about our warmth, we've talked about our moisture, we've talked about our protection. Now what about our air? I mentioned air. And so inside this egg, when we get into our egg parts, there is actually a little pocket of air that is essential for our chick to hatch. Imagine if you're trying to hatch and you're developing this shell, you're just kind of encased in this little bubble, and you need to breathe. So inside this egg, there's a little pocket of air called an air cell that the chick will use to take their first breath of air to begin their struggle out into the world. Okay, so we've talked about all the things needed for a chicken to hatch, and I mentioned that takes 21 days. So it's 21 days of consistency with all of those factors. So the heat, the humidity, and that turning, of course. If there is a break in that cycle, then you may have a delayed hatch, or it won't hatch at all. So it's really important that that happens, okay? Now, with all that going on, say all those conditions are met, what's going on inside? What are all the parts of our egg that are essential to that hatching? And so we have our diagram here, and before we explore into our egg, we're going to go over that part. And so, if you've all had eggs before, you may have seen it or done some baking. You don't have to necessarily eat the eggs, but have done some baking, then you've seen the parts of the egg. So you've seen that yellow part, the yolk, and you've seen kind of that white or clear kind of gooey stuff. That's about all you see, really. That's the egg white, or albumin. Now, for us, there's just these two pieces. Use them in pies or for breakfast or things like that. But for a chicken, rather important stuff in here. And so the yolk is kind of like a bed for the chicken, okay? It has this little spot that we'll get into. It's hard to see from here, but as we break open our egg, there's a spot where the life begins. It is called the germinal disc. So here we have the germinal disc, which is like a data bank, so to speak. It's all the genetic information for our developing chick. And what happens is all those conditions for life are met. We have the warmth, we have the humidity, we have the turning. That germinal disc begins to grow. It sends out blood vessels into the yolk and into the albumin, and it begins to take all those nutrients in so that it can grow. Now, it's kind of like if you were in your bed and you had a fridge right next to your bed. That'd be the best. Pretty cozy, got a lot of food, everything you need right there for you. And so what happens is it absorbs all these things and starts to grow. Now, what nutrients does the yolk have? What nutrients does these albumin have? That's the big question. And so the yolk, it's yellow, bright, and rich. It's full of proteins and fats that are essential for that developing embryo. Okay, and so if you are, say maybe you're exercising or you're trying to build some muscle, then you hear a lot of people eat a lot of eggs. And so that's very true. Eggs are very rich in proteins and low in calories, which is great. It's about 6 to 7 grams of protein in an entire egg, and about maybe 5 or so grams of fat in the egg itself. Now, for the egg white, okay, it's also some protein, not as much, about 3 grams of protein in just the egg white itself. But the healthier part of the egg white, or albumin, is that it doesn't have the fat. Okay, it's very low in the calories. No fats like it does in the yolk. Okay, so like doctors may say, oh, you're eating a lot of eggs, maybe it's a high in cholesterol. But if you just substitute with the egg whites, little nutritional value, the egg whites don't have the fats and cholesterols like the egg yolks do. So if you're eating a lot of eggs, maybe eat a couple eggs and add in some egg white for that extra value, without, of course, the side effects of the fat. Now, for our embryo, though, our developing chick, they need all that. Okay, they're growing, they need to build strong bones, strong muscles, so that they can break free and survive and thrive in the outside world. And so our albumin, the egg white, has those extra bit of extra bit of proteins, and also has vitamins and minerals so that they get those strong bones and strong muscles, so that they can survive. Moving on to our other parts, though, these are things that we don't typically pay attention to or see when we are cooking with our eggs or doing our baking or things like that. And these two little parts right here, these little strings, and when we break into our egg, we'll see those. Those are called chalaza. Okay, kind of a funky word, but they're really, really important. So for us, have you ever taken an egg and maybe shaken it around a bit and done all this? You can kind of feel a little bit of movement, but what happens is if you were to crack this open, it's not scrambled. Why is that? Gotta think about it. The reason is because these chalaza attach to a membrane on the inside of your egg onto your yolk. And they're like a seatbelt. So if you're in a car, pretend this is a car, we're the passenger. These are the seatbelts, the chalaza, that keep us sturdy and secure in our car. These chalaza keep the yolk and our embryo intact. Because if mama hen is rolling her egg around, if we didn't have that chalaza, that seatbelt, our yolk and our baby would just be bouncing around inside the shell and get scrambled. And then we wouldn't have a chick. And for us, if we had scrambled eggs all the time, it would ruin baking, it would ruin when we make our eggs, maybe like sunny side up or easy, you don't want scrambled eggs. So that is what that chalaza does. All right, and we'll get into that once we explore our egg. The next part that we don't quite see, as I mentioned it, is that membrane. Now we kind of see it, kind of don't. When we crack open our egg, the yolk is just sitting there, nice and intact. Sometimes it may be broken depending on how it comes out of the shell, but it stays intact. And so that is called the vitelline membrane. And that membrane keeps it all together, so it wasn't just floating around. Because, like I mentioned before, if it was floating around inside of our shell, it would be scrambled. And then our germinal disc, okay, would just be floating around, and it would not develop, it would not develop into our chick. And then for us, of course, if we were to break this open, we just have scrambled egg, and that would kind of ruin any baking recipe that needs just egg yolks. Okay? There also is a second membrane that goes on the inside of our shell. If you've ever had an egg that has been cracked, or when you're in the store and you're checking your eggs and you say check for cracks, you may see some eggs that have a little bit of crack, but nothing's coming out of them. But surely the shell is cracked, right? That second membrane protects from the breaks. So, say for example you're on the farm, Mama hen is away getting some water, getting some food real quick, and maybe a fox or something scratches the eggs or it rolls and it cracks and breaks. That protects that egg from now being ruined and spoiled, okay? Also, that second membrane has a little moisture to it, and so if it does crack, it will kind of dry up and seal up to kind of form a secondary layer, kind of like another shell. And it's really important and actually kind of interesting when the chicks hatch, okay? And we'll get into that a little later. But that is our membranes of the egg. Moving on to our other part is I mentioned air, where that air is at in our egg. And I mentioned there's an air cell or air pocket, and it sits kind of in the top of the egg right here, okay? Now that is incredibly important because if our developing chick is born inside this egg and is ready to be born, I should say, they need oxygen, just as all the life on Earth needs oxygen to survive, okay? Or some form of oxygen if you're a fish. And they get this oxygen from inside this air cell. So it's sealed off from that membrane, so there's not just a bubble of air floating around in here, because then that would be very challenging and probably mess things up inside. But this air pocket is sealed off by the membrane, and the chicks use their beak to then poke it, inhale, and begin fighting out. Okay? Now, so we've got most of the parts. Talked about our shell. We have our yolk, we have our chalaza, we have our membrane, we have our shell, we have our air cell, we have our germinal disc. That's pretty much all of the parts of our egg. Okay? So, I think we're ready to explore all those parts and find out where they are and what they look like. All right, so we're gonna do our exploration. We'll have our handy dandy sheet here to kind of make sure we're labeling the parts correctly. And I also have, we have our key, which is also helpful, but we're gonna fill it in by ourselves. So with our egg, if you're at home or wherever you are doing this, make sure you have a nice surface that you can work on. You want to do a nice, strong, hard crack on a surface or a corner. When we're doing this exploration, you want to make sure that if you are using your hands, you use 2 fingers. Of course, keep the germs to a minimum, because with raw egg, there are germs and things you don't want to ingest when it's raw, as with like cookie dough, and why you don't eat cookie dough raw, but sometimes we still do it. You can use, alternatively, a toothpick, but just be careful if you are using a toothpick that you don't poke the yolk, or else you will ruin that second membrane and it will spill out and then make it harder to see all the other parts of it. You could also use a pencil. It's not as sharp as a toothpick, but it's still precise so that you can kind of move things and touch things and see it that way. So let's dive into it. Now remember, we're looking for all those parts that we just talked about. So we're gonna do a nice whoop, hard crack. I shattered mine, and I shattered my yolk. It's hard to do on a little table here, not a corner, but we're gonna make it work. So we can still see that membrane, even though we have a busted yolk. I'll use my fingers here. So we can see, if you look very carefully, just like I'd mentioned, and kind of looks like this image too, this little twist right here, this little strand of goop, kind of looks like a white booger in here. But on both ends, that is our chalaza. Okay, that's the seatbelt that keeps our egg, or our yolk in the middle of our egg. Okay, luckily my poor breaking didn't ruin that. But we can kind of see those. You can kind of tease it out a little bit with your finger and see how it's kind of stranded, or a strand kind of woven. Almost looks like a string of yarn all knotted up. It's pretty cool. Also, if we look next to that, you can see how our yolk is kind of wrinkled here along there. And so that is that secondary membrane that's kind of wrinkling since I broke the yolk. And that's the membrane that keeps it intact. And clearly you can see right here, there's that hole in that membrane that allowed all the yolk to kind of leak out. Now, if we didn't have that, then this is what the inside of our egg would look like all the time. And we don't want that. If I were gonna try and bake a cake that called for 3 egg yolks, I wouldn't be able to use this. So, moving on, I may have to crack another egg just to show you that germinal disc, but we'll get that in a little bit. So let's see if I can find it here. with your eggshell, we're going to look for that other membrane. And you can kind of see it right here, very carefully. So here is that other membrane that lies on the inside of the shell. So this is that extra layer of protection in our shell that keeps it safe if our egg were to crack and try to break on us. So you can kind of see here, if the egg was intact, this little crack here, it wouldn't be too bad. That membrane, as you can kind of see, is keeping it together. And this, if the chick is trying to hatch, they have to break through this. This is actually really hard to get through. And one of the scary parts about a chicken hatching is if they break through this but not fully and it dries, it's almost like breaking through a secondary shell. And so that's kind of one of the fascinating things about life. Alrighty. So let's see if we can keep on looking. Let's try to see if we can find our air cell. I may have popped it in breaking open our egg. Let's see. Nope. I may have to, oh, kind of. Let's see. I may do another egg just to kind of show you a better view of it, but let's see if I can get it here. So I'll use my toothpick for this one. So right here, this little pocket, this little bubble, almost messed it up with that first break of the egg, but you can kind of see that it's not attached to the egg. And so that is that air cell that we were talking about. That is the first breath for your chicken. I'll pop it open now so you can kind of see. But right here is where that air cell is. It's in the top of the egg, or bottom, depending on which side you're looking at. You can also see, if you're ever boiling an egg, when you boil an egg, it kind of doesn't come out the perfect shape of the egg. It kind of has that flat bottom. And so that's where that air cell is. And so it keeps that shape. It's pretty cool. All right, let's see if we can find. So we've got our shell, of course. We've got our secondary membrane that we found. We found our chalaza right here. You can kind of see there. We found our vitelline membrane. And now all that's left is to find that germinal disc. And so it may hard to find on this egg, but I came prepared. So we're going to move this one aside and see if we can get a good break to get a shot of that germinal disc. I'm going to use the side of my table here real quick. Nope, it's not going to want to do it. All right, I'll be very careful here. Aha! There we go. Much better. And so, actually, I'll see if the air cell is easier to see. That's kind of better than the other one. That's okay. All right. So, may need to be a little bit of an exploration here to find it. It's usually on the side of your yolk. You're looking for a tiny little white speck. So you carefully have to maneuver and position your egg so that you can better see it. It's kind of hard to see in this one. Let's see if I can find it. It's very faint, and it could also just be the reflection, but there's a small little white speck right here, and that is your germinal disc. And so that is where the life will begin. And that is where, actually the cool part about a developing embryo or chicken egg is after 7 days of incubation, blood vessels begin to form and the eye begins to form, and you can kind of see that when you do what's called candling, which is where you have your egg and you'll shine a light through it, and that light will then of course go through the egg except for those blood vessels, and you'll see a nice little blood vessel path. But here is where we can really kind of get a little fun with exploring our egg parts and see if we can pick up our chalaza to see just how tough it is. And tough it is to pick up. But as you're doing this, if you're trying to grab the chalaza, remember, using your 2 fingers, you'll kind of feel how sturdy it is once it is in your fingers. You can kind of feel. And it feels like a string. And see how I'm kind of picking up that egg? And so that's how it happens and how it hangs inside and secures itself inside of that egg. It's pretty cool. And so those are all the parts of our egg. And so our yolk, our chalaza, our germinal disc was over here, our membrane, our egg white or albumin, we had our shell, and we had our membrane inside the shell. Perfect. We are now masters in the parts of the egg. Nice job. Okay, now that you're masters in the parts of the egg, we've gone through all of our parts. Feel free to, of course, create your own diagram, or you can find egg part diagram online and print it off and fill it out. I like to color it, so that way you can kind of see and commit it to memory. But once again, hope you enjoy this little lesson here, and thanks for joining me.